Hello, my name is Christine Tran, and I am pleased to welcome you to this playful entry as part of the Massey Dialogue series. Massey College is built on land where many indigenous peoples have lived. It is on the treaty lands and the territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit Nation, as well as the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat and Haudenosaunee peoples. We want to acknowledge our duty of stewardship towards the land and the great privilege that we have to work upon it. As today's dialogue concerns the role of digital games in our communities, we must reckon with the legacies of colonial rule and how this legacy has affected indigenous peoples' rights to live and work as well as play upon it. Through games, Canada is entangled into the complex global supply chains that constitute the global technology industry. According to a report by the Entertainment Software Association, there are over 900 active video game studios in Canada. The video game industry constitutes more than $5 billion of our GDP, employing tens of thousands of full-time workers and countless more less accounted for freelance time and temporary workers at this intersection of technology and entertainment. As a country, this puts Canada just behind the United States and Japan among the most game-producing nations in the world. It thus becomes necessary to historicize Canada's specific role in shaping the role that digital games play and leisure have in our everyday lives on both the global, national, as well as local scales. I know for many individuals, games represent among our first socializations in the public life and technology. Board games, chess, Tetris, you name it. As such, games also mark many of our first encounters with the politics of life's unfairness. How many of us, of course, bear painful memories of being denied access to the board, the computer, the clubhouse, fighting with siblings for control over that console for a turn? At systemic levels, this question of fair gaming has expanded to public spaces and careers in the technology industry. From the toxicity of chat boxes and massive multiplayer online games and harassment and live streaming to sexual discrimination scandals that have haunted the larger game studios across the world, inequality persists in games culture to limit the participation of women, queer people, and racialized people in the full benefits of digital gaming. Thus, the history of digital play and games in Canada is also one of exclusion. By politicizing games today, we better realize inequalities at the heart of public leisure technology and raise the fraught question of who works so we can play. Nonprofits and organizations in Canada have emerged to answer these questions of inequality and offer community-based resources for queer and gendered people put at ill advantage by these gaming conditions. To name a few here, there's Pixels, the Feminist Gaming Incubator in Montreal, similar work being done by Damage Plus Labs in Toronto, and of course queer games conferences and queer games carnivals, once based in Concordia and other universities. And from this position point today, from the university, I want to acknowledge that Canada has also played a vital intellectual role in game studies as a discipline. As universities develop not only game studies and minors, but also entire esports programs and housing infrastructure to support the expanse of games in Canada, the future of the university itself is embedded in the future of games, ostensibly. Today, this panel wants to build upon the merit and spirit built by American game scholars like Aaron Trammell, who wants us to recognize how the politics of play have also set the conditions for toxic communities to thrive within the space that the alibi of just playing provides. And to only define play and games in terms of those who have the privilege of leisure and surplus is to inflict cruelty upon our own imaginations of what games can look like. Thus, in this panel, I want us to ask and bring our collective expertise to consider what is at stake of bringing politics into play for a digital society, and what is Canada's role in shaping conditions in the global games and tech industry, and in the end, what kind of infrastructures can we together today as scholars, as makers, policymakers, and players build to create more equitable terms of gaming in the future? And to answer these questions, I'm proud to present today's trio of amazing speakers. First, we have Dr. Gerald Voorhees. Professor Gerald Voorhees is an associate professor in the Department of Communication Arts at the University of Waterloo. He researches games and new media as sites for the construction and contestation of identity and culture, and has edited books on masculinity in games, feminism in play, role-playing games, and first-person shooters. Co-edits Bloomsbury's Approaches to Game Studies book series and was managing editor of the Gender and Play trilogy and Palgrave Games' In Context book series. He is also president of the Canadian Game Studies Association. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Next to him, we have Kaelan Doyle Myerscough. Kaelan is a game designer and scholar interested in the historics and design processes of fictional world building. Before coming to do a PhD in media studies at the University of Chicago, they earned a Master of Sciences in Comparative Media Studies from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where they wrote a thesis on the intimate affects in contemporary video games. As part of the Gamma Space Co-op, Kaelan designed the narrative and provided the writing for 2 seasons of the Real Big Trainer, an educational game for Humber and Seneca colleges. Kaelan's most recent work is the Archipelago, a narrative game about tea and trauma that they developed as part of the Brain Mind residency. This game is available on Steam, Android, and itch.io. Thank you so much for joining us, Kaelan. And to their left, I have Dr. Christopher J. Young. Dr. Christopher J. Young is a librarian and head of collections and digital scholarship at the University of Toronto, Mississauga, and a sessional instructor at the Faculty of Information, where he teaches graduate level courses on critical game studies and digital scholarship. His research is in the field of media and communication studies, recombining knowledge and media industry's digital app economies, specifically engaging in discourse around the circuits of game production. He is curator of the Sid Bolton collection that includes over 14,000 video games, in addition to thousands of print and paratextual materials, hardware, and peripheral technologies. That sounds like an amazing find for the university. Thank you so much for your work in leading this initiative. And a fun fact, Chris is also an alumni and junior fellow at Massey College, so we welcome your return to campus, Christy.
Thank you for having me.
So yeah, thank you so much for coming here and wanting to speak as broadly and specifically as possible about the role, and specifically your own local to national embedded role in this broad category of the games community. And considering we all might into this context of leisure and games from different areas of expertise, maybe we want to start with a bit of the personal. So I would like to go around and position ask you each how you came to your current role, however you want to define it in the Canadian games research community. Or if I could rephrase more briefly, how did games change your life for the better and worse, if you want to get into that? Would you like to start first?
Sure, it'd be my pleasure. First of all, thank you for having me. It's wonderful to participate in this dialogue. To answer the question, I came to games through a couple of different ways. I think the first sort of core experience of mine that brought me to my fascination with games was a summer day camp that I participated in when I was 10, 11, and they'd give us 45 minutes a day in front of in front of an NES system. So if you could imagine, 45 8 through 12-year-olds crowded around 4 NES systems. There was this sense of play, of course, but also community, spectatorship, engagement, dialogue, people shouting, encouragement, hints, tech tips and tricks, and of course trash talk. And just the nature of the richness, right, of the social interaction around that experience really stuck with me. And then, later on in graduate school, as growing up as one of 2 Asian kids in a predominantly white school in South Texas, I'm no stranger to the way that play can be. But in grad school, I encountered this essay written by a very prominent figure in the field of rhetorical studies that took a playful approach to the history of rhetoric, and basically it was very poetic, and it was celebrated for being non-traditional writing in that sense. It was somewhere between poetry and dramaturgy, and it was about rhetoric as a rhetorical figure, as a metaphor for a persona, for an embodiment, denuded and refigured. And while it was, celebrated as this playful performance, I and other colleagues couldn't help but notice, right, the sexual violence in that piece, where, you know, a white scholar in a position, a white male scholar in a position of power, strips down and reclothes rhetoric, right, in order to suit their own purposes and their own instruments and ends. And it just drove home for me the way play, we often think of it as so frivolous and even celebratory and this lighthearted and this wonderful thing to encounter, but often, right, there is not only a deeper social implications connected to play, but also, you know, the great need to take seriously, right, what others are going to often overlook. And that's one of the things that really encouraged me to actually write about and study play in games.
Thanks for sharing that, Gerald.
Yeah, I guess I'll go next. And thanks again for having me, of course. I mean, it's a hard question to answer, like, how games made my life better or worse, because I can't really imagine my life without games, right? I grew up with games, have always been, like, part of my lived experience. And I always noticed a disconnect from when I was a kid between the sort of communicative capacities of games and the ways that games were talked about in sort of like mainstream discourses, right? Like I saw in my like social life growing up, people using games to communicate emotions, to communicate social dynamics, like again, both for better or worse. You talked about Aaron Trammell's work, of course, but just those capacities were sort of a fact of life that I felt was being ignored. And so as I sort of went into my master's degree, I came into that space as a theorist. And I never, even though I loved thinking about games and talking about games and making games, like in sort of personal contexts, I never saw game development as like a possibility for me until I started transitioning, like in the middle of my my master's degree. And it was sort of then when I came out as trans and like needed to find ways to sort of express the kinds of emotions that I was feeling in a medium that felt like comfortable to me and obvious to me, that I started turning to game development. And now as a scholar, I see my work as again like inseparable from games. I think that like really, if we were to ask that question about my scholarship, like how games have made it better or worse, again, it feels kind of inextricable. Mm-hmm. Like my game development practice is a big part of how I think about games, and I can't imagine thinking about games without making them anymore.
Thanks, Kaelan.
Yeah, for me, I think similar to Gerald, like I, you know, was at a camp thing when I was first introduced to games, and that was my initial exposure, and the sociality of it and playing with others, I think, is what really drew me to it. And so when I got older, I think looking at games, I guess through a more of a critical lens, I started to, certainly on the production side of games, that, and other scholars have used this phrase, sort of games are kind of like the canary in the coal mine. In the sense that some of the business models, practices, and the technologies, as well as governance models and so forth, like if you think of end-user agreements and things, a lot of that was developed and came from games in the game industry. And so I enjoyed playing games, but I was like, how are they built? How are they constructed? How are they, you know, these interconnected industries around the globe? How do you track these supply chains of labor and culture into what becomes sort of like a global game? So that really drew me to it. And then alongside that, with my professional side, I remember growing up like thinking, oh, like when you finished playing a game system, you would just discard it and bring the new one. And so what happens to those older systems? And so fortunately for me, sort of becoming a librarian, I was like, okay, so who's taking care of the games? And it turns out not many were, so I took a sort of an adjacent path, learning book history, bibliography, working in a rare book library with special collections, because they were thinking about these things. How do you conserve and preserve these? As many of us will know, there's a lot of dependencies on games with electronics and so forth. So that sort of became my origin story, I guess, of being the curator of a game collection. Is that, you know, I had to figure out, okay, if we're going to do this and sell it to the university, how's it going to happen? So yeah, that's.
And what an origin story. And I'm glad Christopher brought up the context of like university libraries. And I acknowledge that everybody on this panel is doing work in games adjacent or embedded in some relationship to the institution of the Canadian academia. And from that subject position, I want to ask you all what you think is the responsibility of the university in the creation of like equitable, fair, and non-cruel gaming culture.
I can start. I mean, and I think it'd be great if this was a more open dialogue, right? Like, you know, instead of taking turns, because my thought isn't fully formed yet. But I think the first thing that comes to mind for me is that the university, like, maybe has some explaining to do. There's, in a lot of program undergraduates, there has been a push, like, definitely in universities in Ontario and, like, throughout North America, to create games programs that guarantee jobs for graduates, where that's the sort of primary, primary talking point, and where games are sort of framed adjacent to tech. Brendan Keogh's book on the video game industry talks about this a fair bit, about the idea that that game development programs, the way that they're articulating what it means to be a game developer and make games has significant impacts in both who comes into the programs and graduates from them, and then who sees themselves in the industry. And beyond that, I think also the sort of formalization of game development education has created a system where people, where universities become the kind of gatekeepers for getting into certain industry positions. And not all of them, right? Like, you know, most games are made independently by small groups of people who may or may not have gone through any kind of formal education process to get to that point. But I think the system of accreditation that has built up in the university in the last like 10 to 15 years in kind of a slapdash way, like if we're being honest, that's graduating like far more students than there are positions in the industry. I think it's something that we have to think about both as educators who are designing curricula and as practicing developers, maybe ourselves, or like people who work with game developers in professional capacities, right?
Thanks for that, Kaelan. And for reference, the book Kaelan referenced by Brian Keogh is called The Video Game Industry Does Not Exist, an amazing title.
Yeah.
If I could jump in, I would say that you know, to echo and sort of extend some of Kaelan's points, there is a lot for the university to answer for universities to answer for. You know, we pretty much every Canadian university, every North American university has a Department of English Language and Literature where we study literature because we recognize its cultural importance, not only shaping how people see the world, but also in shaping the way that we can imagine, right? The tools that we have to imagine the world differently. And video games in general do very similar things. And in fact, I would say that they do both of those things maybe even better, right, than traditional literature, particularly, I think, giving us the tools to imagine the world differently, right, because they are these interactive experiences in which we can actually contribute, right, to building the world differently. And right, while every Canadian university, every university in North America is going to have a literature department that is going to help you to study and analyze and understand those texts and to understand how those texts relate to the social conditions in which they're produced, and to the historical developments, right, that come before and after them, and put them in relation, right, to all those social dynamics. You do not have those programs for games. Rather, you have programs that are focused on game design and development. A lot of these in the colleges, in various colleges throughout Canada, but some of them, right, in universities. And while some of these programs, I'm thinking of the program at Laurier, which I very much applaud because it has the idea of that this is a critical game design program, but nevertheless, right, you do not see programs on games, right, that are focused on literacy, on the culture, the social dynamics of those games, and I think that's a real that's a real loss, not only for Canadian universities but also for Canadians who could, right, better understand, I mean, obviously how they are using and the relationships that they develop between themselves and others, but also how they understand their relationship to the world in which they but it's also a loss for, Canadian citizens, folks broadly, that, we're not giving those people the tools to to think critically about how the world building that we do in games, right, can also translate to the world that we actually, right, live and breathe and labor in. And I think that's an incredible missed opportunity that the university should apologize for.
Yeah, just to build on Kaelan and Gerald, we were having a conversation to this degree on my campus last week that Christine was at, and we were discussing the idea of potentially having a game jam at our campus. And for those who are unfamiliar with what a game jam is, it's usually where you produce a prototype of a game in 24 to 72 hours, usually over a weekend. And in many ways it replicates the industry practice of crunch, which is overwork, which can lead to poor health and mental health, and the exploitation of those workers' labor. And so one of my colleagues at this meeting, raised the point as we were discussing it, and it made me reflect, and I think everyone else reflect, that we're not meant to replicate the industry in the university. We're meant to, as Gerald was saying, provide the tools and methods for students to transform it, and to, as Christine had laid out with the opening segment, right, to make it more equitable and to address many of those inequities, whether it's transracial, gender, but also the labor and practices, because it is endemic across the industry, and I think that's where we can, as educators, step in to address it.
Yeah. I mean, it's a tough problem, right? Because on the one hand, there's pressure sort of on the administrative side and on the budget side to extend offers of partnership to private entities like game studios who would like for university programs to be pipelines into jobs at their studios, right? And then on the other side, there's students who are increasingly aware of the precarious nature of labor in the industry and professionalizing earlier and earlier, right? You have high school students fretting about how to learn Unity so that they can get a Unity programming job in 6 years or whatever. And at the case of my institution in particular, and I've seen this at other schools as well, students lobbying for education that is very technical in nature and worrying about competition from schools that are more technical. And then, getting the pressure from the other side makes it harder as critical scholars to carve out a space. How do you maybe not acquiesce to the demand to create a purely technical pipeline program into a job that will burn students out and cause them severe harm, while also acknowledging that that students are entering into a really frightening job market. They're entering into conditions of precarity, certainly especially in the game industry, but in any job that they're going to go into, right?
Yeah, it's a really fraught question because there absolutely is that pressure. One of my first university job was as a incoming assistant professor at a small liberal arts university in North Carolina, and I came in with the charge to create a game design program. And the first thing that I did when I came in there is say, I'm not a game developer, right? I'm a game studies person. What I know about game design and development, I know on accident in order to better study games as texts and the social implication and the social relationships wound up in that. But I had an incredible chair that was very cognizant of those pressures that you're speaking about, Kaelan, and was willing to bear most of those on his shoulders, and basically told me, to design a program where the students will get enough of the tools and techniques that they need to be industry ready, but that will actually prepare them to look at and think about games from another perspective, so that they're not simply replicating what other people are already doing. So they're not simply learning best practices, but so that they're learning how to think and innovate on existing genres, on existing play styles and mechanics, and on the social dynamics that surround those existing genres and games. And I think that that's really what university education should be for. Particularly if it must prepare students for trades, for professions, it must also prepare them to think critically about the way that those professions currently operate. And here, I'm not simply talking about creative practices and innovating game genres and gameplay and mechanics and et cetera, but I'm also thinking about the way that those professions operate in ways that are often, as Chris noted earlier, exploitative of labor, and that involve that crunch and other extractive techniques and styles of management and operation. And yeah, I think it's really important that a game education, teach about that as well.
You brought up also something that maybe I also think the university should apologize for in addition, which is the nature of graduate education in game studies, I think that a lot of game studies scholars, I'm not aware of any graduate level dedicated game studies program, although there's some that are kind of informal, A lot of game studies, PhDs, and master's students are situated in media studies departments, film studies departments like myself, literature departments, a sort of mishmash of different places. And the kind of work that we do doesn't always involve game design, or, in the case of a lot of grad students, that game design work is on your own time. If you learn how to use Unity, it's work that you're doing in addition to your dissertation work. And then a lot of PhDs in more theoretical aspects of game studies end up going into these design-oriented programs. So I think that there's some thinking to be done in the realm of graduate education as well to to sort of contend with the way that games specifically, that the study of games involves understanding the practice of games. I've met a number of people with PhDs in game studies who don't know exactly how it works to put a game on Steam, which is a significant of game development, and not just from a practical perspective as a creator, but also thinking about the sort of platform economy of the game industry and the realities of working conditions in the industry. Thinking about that through Steam is, I think, really important. So, I think it's a structural problem, and also a problem of increasing professionalization of PhDs who are being expected to have written a book and 10 articles and also be a professional game industry person for several years before getting your first tenure track job. But yeah, it's a really difficult question.
Thank you all for being up to the task to answer that question with all your amazing context. And as much as we would love to incubate the solution completely from within the walls of the university, inevitably, as you've all raised, this requires conversation and collaboration with institutions and individuals outside of the ivory towers as well. So to broaden out this idea of what the creation of equitable game What work must be done by like non-university institutions related to games, do you think, to how you say address these issues of equity? Because I mentioned Toronto is very blessed to be positioned to be in relation to all these different nonprofits and like minority organizations dedicated to equitable gaming. But in terms of, Kaelan mentioned digital platforms like Steam, storefronts, and I mentioned the fraught legacy of the AAA video game studio. I guess is a roundabout way to say what would you like to see from major gaming institutions themselves in terms of pushing forward change? Yes, Chris?
Yeah. I think a lot of the community organizations, especially the ones I'm more familiar with in Toronto, they do a lot of excellent work already. And I think I would ask our government and the larger industry players to sort of pick up a bit more. So when we look at the game industry in Canada, the North American industry scheme for like determining if it's like a game publisher or a game studio, the vast majority, there's about, I think, 1,800 companies and then about 250 publishers, and over 85% of those are like less than 100, and 50% of them are just one-person teams. So it's very low. So it means that we have lots of really, really big publishers like Ubisoft, Electronic Arts, Warner Brothers that have 500 plus employees that account for the majority of that. Those industry figures that you will see. And the reason why I bring up industry and government is that the government, our province in Ontario, as well as the other provinces, have tax incentives that benefit those companies directly, where they can get, say in Ontario, 35% of their labor costs covered, and then 40% for other sort of technological expenditures. But our province, like British Columbia, Alberta, Nova Scotia, and Quebec, which is sort of just a handful of them that are doing this, they gatekeep those incentives. So they really benefit foreign-owned companies from producing foreign intellectual property here that gets exported elsewhere. So when we're thinking about the games that are being produced by some of these companies that are addressing these inequities in terms of the work and labor practices, but also the kinds of games that are being made, they're not getting the supports that are needed necessarily, or if they are, it's through small cultural arts grants and not these larger tax incentives that can really help them not just make games, but also be sustainable to continue to make those games.
Yeah, it's really interesting. This is a small anecdote, but when I was at GDC just a few weeks ago, there's a sort of section of the expo floor where a bunch of different trees get to sort of show off their like their national video game character or whatever, right? Like they Switzerland had a booth with a bunch of indie games, and Italy and Germany and France and Belgium, and all of them were showing off like sort of smaller games that had been produced in the country. And then the Canadian booth had no games and only brochures with the kinds of tax incentives and benefits that are provided by the Canadian government. Which is very funny because Canada has actually, and Ontario specifically, like one of the most vibrant indie communities in the world, because we have such a like lively system comparatively of these sort of smaller arts grants that are accessible to developers without a whole bunch of like sort of industry veteran type experience. So there's a very strange disconnect between these two. It does feel like a sort of tale of two cities, right? Of these sort of like these independent developers who are like truthfully competing over like very small amounts of grant money, and the like a lot of the work that the organizations that Christine mentioned, so like DMG and Gamma Space and Hand-Eye Society, a lot of the work they do is teaching people to apply to grants, and helping people apply to grants, giving people access to the grant officers so that they can ask questions to those officers. That's a significant portion of the work thing. And then you have these gigantic companies where people sort of in the indie space maybe strive to get employed there, burn out from there, make their own studios using that experience on their resume. it's a very, very strange kind of ecosystem, and certainly bridging that gap, like financially or using different incentives, should happen. And then also, I think on a cultural level, we should recognize the significant contributions that are being made by indie studios, like culturally and also financially, to the sort of broader landscape of culture and the arts in Canada.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, there's sort of two distinct levels to this. There's the Canadian government, and then there are nonprofits and community organizations. And I think that the nonprofits, NGOs, and community organizations are doing what they can with the resources that they have. They're supporting independent, often marginalized game developers, as not only in their independent projects, but as game development often is a pathway to the industry for many people. They are bringing independent games to wider audiences. They're doing the cultural work of gaining exposure and normalizing, right, new and different ways of playing games. But the resources they have are incredibly limited, as the other, you know, as Kaelan and Chris have pointed out. But then, you know, I think as Kaelan also mentioned, well, as you both also mentioned, the Canadian government could be playing a lot larger role in this. There is, my understanding is that there is currently an initiative by a number of game developers and publishers in Canada to work on this very question, to better understand how they can diversity right into game development in Canada. And when I was talking with the researchers working on, the consultants working on this, you know, the thing that stood out most in my mind, just based on my own experience as well as some recent research that I've done, is that we need to have more of the marginalized people in the development space, right? There need to be queer and trans people developing games and having a voice, right, in the shape of those games. There need to be racialized, there need to be Black and Indigenous people, right, in the center of the game development studio, right? They need to be the lead story designers and the lead character developers, and they need to be, right, the project managers, and they need to have voice. You know, I'm just thinking of how recently there was some discourse around the game Forspoken, which not a Canadian game, right, but which had a Black female lead character, playable character, and there was a lot of criticism from the African American community and from the Black diaspora at large, that this character was very white. And I recall that the nonprofit Black Girl Gamers, you know, came out with a statement that said, you know, hey, this is a great game, you should support it. We were consulted on this. Unfortunately, they brought us in near the end of the development process, and so they couldn't actually do a lot of what we said. But you know, it's still a good game and good representation, etc. But that's the thing, right? People who, the people who are being represented should be a part of the development process early on, whether they are, right, the story designers and the character designers, or whether they are, right, consultants that are brought in the first, right, 10 weeks of the project, that have the ability to shape and give direction to the project itself, as opposed to just providing a stamp of approval right at the very end of the process. And you know, there's so many subsidies that the Canadian government gives to game developers. You know, I don't understand why those subsidies aren't tied to specific efforts and initiatives within the development process, you know, that make sure that these matters are given the attention that they deserve in that process. So, yeah.
Yeah, thanks for all that context. And I would like to remind our virtual audience that you're of course welcome to pose questions for us to answer in real time. But for now, I would like to ask that if you could change, like, scenario, we have like a magic wand, you can do anything you want to change just one thing about the way that we collectively think, talk about, and how we approach games in the Canadian context, whether that be from within the university or the industry or even the player fandom community level, what would that one change be? Wildest dreams.
I'm gonna go small instead of going big, right? Because I think you could say a lot of things about like people taking games more seriously as art, which is absolutely like needed. And when we were talking about before about the about teaching games the same way we would teach literature or film or something, that's a big thing. I think a small thing is actually to rethink the way that we approach grants in Canada and Ontario specifically. The art grant system, the way that you're expected to articulate your projects, one, fits imperfectly with games. So for example, the way that you are expected to articulate whether your project is a full project or a sort of artistic project, when in games, those things are sort of necessarily melded. And also the sheer just amount of like text and sort of vocabulary that is expected of people applying to grants necessarily privileges people with more education. It privileges like traditionally white people. And I think that the work that organizations are doing on the ground to make that more accessible to people is really important, but it's ultimately kind of a Band-Aid when the solution is more funding, but also lower barriers to funding, right? So like things like micro grants, things like, you know, like no questions asked, like funding or funding that's where the level of work you have to do to apply for a kind of grant is more like a Google form than like a 15-page application. I think starting to rethink the ways that we disperse grants and adjudicate grants is like a very small way that I might change the industry in Ontario to give more like financial access to people who are starting out and making their first game or making their second game, and to make it more sustainable to people who are making a living like largely off of these grants, right?
I'm sure other forms of like cultural creation would appreciate as much of a change.
Yeah, exactly.
Gerald?
Sure, yeah. So I will take a different track and I will go big. And at the risk of sounded very naive, it's a commonplace to assume that more communication means more understanding, and that is a naive commonplace. But often more communication under the wrong circumstances actually produces conflict. But at the risk of sounding naive and taking that naive position, I would say that I would hope that more people who game a lot and more people who do not game a lot would have more conversations with one another. You know, these days, everybody plays games, whether it's, you know, the Sudoku in the newspaper or 30 hours a week in front of a PlayStation 5. But nevertheless, right, some people play more games than others, and when people are immersed in a particular culture, like gaming culture, when they're immersed in the techniques of games and the techniques of you know, the rhetorical techniques that games use to draw us in, and the game culture at large, right? You have a slightly different perspective, and you know, to come back to something that I said at the start, I think that there's a lot about how games structure our understanding and our understanding of what's possible within the world, that people who play games a lot, right, could help people who don't play games a lot understand, help them to understand, and I think that sort of exchange and that sort of recognition that there is value in games, not necessarily in that games are telling us things that are absolutely true and positive and progressive to know and important to understand about the world, but sometimes, right, games help shape people's views in ways that are harmful and regressive and generate misconceptions and misperceptions about the world. And I think that it's equally important that people who do not play games understand the ways that games can shape people's understandings and views of the world, whether for good or ill. And I think that to come back also to something that Chris sort of said at the start, you know, games are a canary in a coal mine. They're a killer app. They are bleeding edge technology in a lot of ways, and understand games use those techniques to help us think and see different, help us to also think about how different technologies can help us to think and see differently.
If I could add a third wish or cheat code to our game genie, I would, I guess, and this would be going big as well, is sort of removing or addressing the barriers around sort of the secrecy in the game industry, as well as the sort of perpetual use of non-disclosure agreements for things that do not need NDAs for. In the industry, for those that don't know, once you go into some of these larger studios, you sign these non-disclosure agreements. You're basically told you can't talk about anything, even to people at work. And part of the intention for that is to avoid leaks and so forth and spoilers on 5 to 7 year 5 to 7 years of development for games, but it ends up spilling over into some of the issues of sexual harassment, gender and racial discrimination in the works, which is also quite endemic. And then it also means, I think, which kind of builds off of what Gerald was saying in terms of the communication and potentially leading to other art forms and genres, is it also limits the industry to a replication of the same kinds of games being made over and over again, because folks can't discuss informally. And so a lot of the game organizations that Kaelan and Christine have mentioned have sort of provided some venues for this, for people to kind of informally chat about these kinds of things and topics and issues. And then of course, that's where a lot of the discussion happens around sort of game workers unite, trying to find ways to unionize the industry and so forth. So that would be my big wish, is to try and remove a lot of those barriers around secrecy and tied to the fear of breaching your non-disclosure agreement with the game developer or publisher that you work with.
There's even contracts that I've seen where you're not allowed to make games in your free time, right?
Yeah.
Or like you're not allowed to publish games that you make. Extremely stifling, right? Absolutely.
Yeah. I've seen those too, yeah.
Yeah.
One of my participants in my research study had that exact issue,
Yeah. Which also limits, like it should be said, communication between people with like that kind of professional industry experience and without, right? Both the NDAs do that, and also like these contracts that limit people from making their own things. It stops the kind of like skill sharing and like mentorship that can actually enable marginalized people access into the industry in ways they might not have otherwise.
Exactly, yeah.
Speaking of invisible barriers, I'm reaching out through the internet to bring up an online question that was queued up. Thoreau Backer, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, asks, "Hi, I'm a grad student especially interested in online multiplayers and making it more inclusive/accessible from both a technical and social standpoint. I would love if anyone had thoughts, and so grateful for this panel stream. Thanks." Thank you, Thoreau, for joining in. Does anybody want to join in on that? Certainly, both Gerald and Gerald's experience researching multiplayers.
That sounds like you're putting me on the spot. So I'll just go ahead and say that. So just off the cuff, I think that one thing that's really important is something that Kaelan actually mentioned before the talk, which is content moderation and discussion moderation, and building in tools building in tools, but also building policy, in the end user license agreement for online multiplayer games that set up certain codes of conduct and standards, and building in the tools that will allow the developers and content moderators to use that, I think are incredibly important. That's my initial thought there.
Yeah, I mean, definitely thinking of content moderation as emotional labor and thinking about the sort of like very nuanced set of tools that content moderators have, especially in sort of live situations. But I wanted to shout out specifically Kat Lowe and also Claudia Lowe, no relation, but they've worked together before. And they've both done really excellent work on online content moderation in live streaming situations and online, and the ways that content moderation often gets viewed as a kind of technical job of like banning words, or like, you know, that it's the kind of job they could easily get by AI. Whereas actually a lot of the work that content moderators are doing is sort of improvised, it's very much vibes based, it's again like emotional work. And then I think in addition, when you think about the technical side of online multiplayer, there are very few online multiplayer games because online multiplayer games are very difficult. I look forward to a time when there are more open source tools out there that facilitate online multiplayer development, because there's a lot of really, really rad people out there, marginalized people, who have ideas for online multiplayer games but lack the access to the technical capacity to do it, right? To actually realize those visions. And if we want to make really interesting like online multiplayer experiences, part of what needs to be done is to enable that access, right? Like there's one game that I'm excited about that's coming out soon called Drag Her, which is like a fighting game, but all the characters are drag queens. And like I want to see more of that, you know, more like weird online multiplayer games, like offbeat things that don't have to like be made by 1,000-person studios and get tens of millions of players in order to be considered successful.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know, my information on this will be outdated because I have a 1-year-old that I've been focusing much on, so I haven't played too many games the past year. But with content moderation, my memory as well of a lot of these platforms like Steam and some of the other consoles is that they provide options to report someone cheating in a game, but not necessarily if someone's done sort of abusive language or harassment and so forth. So these companies definitely have infrastructure in place for doing it, and certainly have workers and laborers who perform a lot of that labor and emotional labor. So I think it's doable, but it seems to me, based on last time I looked, so to speak, that they seem to prioritize cheating in games more than the experience of how players are being treated.
Thanks for all that delightful context. And if we don't have another online question, perhaps I thought I'd end it with a provocation that you can take up or not. It's or any audience questions? I'm sorry. No. Okay. I can end on my little provocation here. I'm going to do the potentially humbling act of describing a meme in real life, but I wanted to get your response to this from all your expertise. Games journalist Jordan Mallory last year tweeted this mimetic mantra going around in development Twitter, where he stated, "I want shorter games with worse graphics made by people who are paid more to work less, and I am not kidding." I see Kaelan's that, and definitely there's this and I'm glad Kaelan and Chris and Gerald have brought to light all this, like the thousands of labor hours and hundreds of people that go behind seemingly even like your advanced like AAA games. And I want to know, what do you think about the future of play, potential in equitable play and better conditions, laying and making worse games, like shorter games, worse graphics, as we talked a bit about like the content of what games are valued, what games sell, what games make it to the Steam store. You think like Mallory's statement is a little bit oversimplifying it and maybe positioning like better games as equitable working conditions as a trade-off between like worse games? And you can take this up in any way you'd like or not at all. I'm very fascinated to think about that trade-off. Like, do we need another big, like, multi-hour AAA multiplayer, a game that deprives people time away from their 1-year-olds?
I guess no. Yeah, I mean, when I hadn't come across that tweet before, it makes me think as well about how the industry is really sort of focused on pushing technological limits in terms of visualizations and putting in a focus on that rather than the actual quality of the design and the writing of the game. I think if they had less focus on that, you could perhaps see more interesting things being done potentially in pushing genres and maybe art forms that aren't photorealistic. You know, I guess we don't need another game, but perhaps we could do with lots of other kinds of games that perhaps are made by different groups of people, and perhaps voices that have the chance to sort of sit in the hot seat as creative director or designer can perhaps work on many of these other smaller projects as part of a larger publisher or studio. That's sort of my take on it, I guess.
I mean, I feel like we're still living in the wake of that dreadful, horrible mistake marketing push in like the 2010s to frame video games as like a car and gamers as sort of like participants in a primarily sort of technical sphere, right? Where like the quality of a game and the value of a game is assessed based on how much content there is and how shiny the content is. Like literally, like how, you know, like how well the light bounces your hair or whatever is a determinant of like the quality of a game. And I'm optimistic that people in the sort of AAA industry are trying to think differently. I saw that tweet at GDC, which makes me a little optimistic that people are talking about it. And then I think of games like Pentiment, which are made in sort of AA, AAA atmospheres, but feel like reminiscent games and are trying to think about different like ways of having games relate to history and to different forms of aesthetics and aesthetic lineages. But yeah, I mean, definitely in the academy and as game producers and like in funding structures and everywhere, I think that we need to like think trying to dismantle a way of thinking about games and to create a new way of thinking about games. In addition to, you know, like the provocation for game makers, right?
Yeah, and I mean, ditto to everything that Chris and Kaelan have said, but I would also say that I think that meme over-identified the game industry and with the game as text, and I think over-determines the power of the game as text. You know, as the question from the viewer online, you know, recently pointed out to us, there's a whole lot to think about in terms of how people play games and the communities that organize around them. And just, you know, going back to my initial experience in NES with 40 other kids in day camp, you know, the game has a lot to do to shape that experience, but ultimately it's the community and the culture that develops around it, right? Amongst those players, 40 people or 40 million people, if you're thinking, right, national context, and the norms and the patterns of communication and use or supports or cooperation that they tolerate and that they glorify. You know, we are almost 10 years past Gamergate, but the impact of that on North American culture and American culture especially, but North American culture at large is, I think, still reverberating and being felt. And so ditto to everything that's been said regarding that quote in the industry, but also let's not simply focus on the game and assume that a better game that respects the quality of life of the people who make it will make for a better gaming experience or game culture.
Thanks so much for all that context, and thank you, Gerald. You brought it full circle back to your opening narrative. I couldn't have scripted this better if I was an algorithm. Thank you so much to our audience in the present room, and also our delightful tech coordinator, Joe, for bringing us together. Thank you to our virtual audience, of course, our delightful speakers for coming to have this dialogue with us, and Alyssa Ginsberg for bringing us together behind the scenes in this space. I hope you at home have a safe and equitable play experience wherever it takes you. And please enjoy, please continue sharing and subscribing into Massey Colleges and the Massey Dialogue's upcoming program of delightful other talks into the new year. Take